1, go.
Okay, so very good morning, class. My name is Ritik Roy, again back with some new topics of the chapter Force, Pressure, and Friction. Since in the last class we have studied about what is force, what are different types of force, and a certain bit methods of how to solve the numericals of are related to force, and we have got a pinch of idea regarding force, regarding friction, and what are the causes of friction. In today's class, we will be taking the topics further. Okay, so let's start today's class. I hope you will enjoy the session. And in the previous class, if you have any sort of doubt, you can go back to the video of the previous class, and you can get the proper idea, which will make your concepts very crystal clear. So let's start our today's class. So what we have studied about friction in the previous class is that friction is a force which opposes the relative motion of an object, right? So suppose if this is an object, and if the object is moving in this direction, so a force will always act in the opposite direction, which will oppose the motion of this object, and this force is known as force of friction, right? So what frictional force does? Frictional force opposes the relative motion the relative motion of an object relative motion between the surfaces in contact. Between the surfaces in contact. Okay, and also in the last class we have studied about the causes of friction. So what were the causes of friction? One was the interlocking between the two surfaces, right? And the another cause, if I say, that is nothing but the ploughing effect. So the question comes is, what is ploughing effect? What is ploughing effect? What is ploughing effect, right? So let's try to understand what is ploughing effect. Now see, suppose this is an object. This is an object and it is relatively soft in nature. Now what will happen? Suppose I have kept an iron ball just above the surface. I have kept an iron ball just above the surface. Now because of the weight of this ball, which is heavier in weight and harder as compared to this soft material, this soft body will slowly starts to get deformed, and finally this will come and will touch the surface of the soft body. Okay, so when some softer materials get deformed and sink into the surface of another object, and it comes in contact with them, so the consequence of this sinking surface in one another is known as the ploughing effect. Okay, so what is ploughing effect? The consequence of the sinking surface in one another is known as ploughing effect. Is known as ploughing effect. Ploughing effect. Okay, and because of this ploughing effect, what I have told, what will happen? This softer material which we have, this will get deformed. It will get deformed. Will get deformed, and since it is deforming, so finally what will happen? The material which is more in weight or hard, that will sink down, and the two surfaces will come in contact with each other, and this is known as the ploughing effect. So till now what we have studied that frictional force is the force which opposes the relative motion between the object, relative motion between the surfaces in contact, and also it acts in the opposite direction of the motion. Then we have studied the causes of friction is that number one is flowing effect. Okay, so what is flowing effect? The consequence of the sinking surfaces in one another is known as flowing effect. And the another thing that we have studied is that the interlocking of the two surfaces. So these were the two causes of the flowing effect. Now the thing that comes up is what is then friction depends. So friction depends on two factors. So the next point of discussion is friction depends on friction depends on number one, nature of the surfaces in contact. Nature of surfaces in contact. So what kind of the surfaces are in contact? This means what? If the surfaces which are in contact are rough, then what will happen? The frictional force, the amount of frictional force will be more. If the surfaces are smooth, the amount of frictional force will be less. So if surfaces in contact are rough, then the amount of friction will. So if the surfaces in contact are rough, then the amount of friction will be more. And if the surfaces in contact is smooth, then the amount of friction will be less. So the thing that we have to remember that friction always depends on the nature of surfaces in contact. And second is what? Thrust. Now what is thrust? First let us understand that. Okay. Suppose this is an object. Okay. And in this object the force that we are applying is perpendicular to the surface. The force that we are applying is perpendicular to the surface. So this perpendicular force which is acting on the surface is known as the thrust. So how it gets effect on thrust? So greater thrust more will be the value of friction. Greater thrust more will be the value of friction. Means what? So the two factors on which friction depends is one is nature of surfaces in contact and another is thrust. So greater thrust more will be the value of friction. Now what happens? Basically friction is broadly classified under three headings. Okay, so what are those three headings? Friction. So the three headings under which friction is broadly studied is one is static friction, one is sliding friction, and one is rolling friction. One is rolling friction. Now the question that comes up is then what do you mean the static friction, what do you mean sliding friction, and what do you mean rolling friction? Okay, so the term static friction it's itself self-explanatory. Means what? In this the body will not be in motion. Okay, and the surface area of contact in case of static friction will be more. The surface area of contact in this will be more. Then the thing that comes up is sliding friction. So what will happen in sliding friction? The body will be sliding over the surface, surface, and the surface area of contact will be more as compared to rolling friction, but less as compared to static friction. And in rolling friction, the surface area of contact will be less. Since in static friction, what is happening in static friction, the body is in rest, and in sliding and rolling friction the body is in motion. So we can say that friction is broadly classified into static friction and kinetic friction. In kinetic friction, the two types of friction that we have is sliding friction and rolling friction. Okay, now the thing that we have to remember is, what is then the definition of sliding friction? Because static friction definition is pretty clear, I hope, to all. Yes. Sliding friction. So what is sliding friction? The resistance created between two surfaces when sliding against each other is called sliding friction. Sliding friction. Okay, so what is sliding friction? It is the resistance created between the two surfaces, okay, when they are sliding against each other. So when one surface is sliding over the other, the resistance force that will be created is known as sliding friction. Got it? Okay, now see, if I talk about the three cases, so how? Okay, suppose this is a body which is direct with the surface of contact, okay, and in this body I am applying the force, okay. So this body is at rest, so it is known as static friction. Now if this is the surface, and over this surface, suppose if the body is sliding, okay, so what will happen? This is known as sliding friction. And if this is the surface, and on this surface if suppose this body is rolling, then we call it as rolling friction. So friction is broadly classified into three headings: static friction, sliding friction, and rolling friction. So sliding friction is the resistance created between two surfaces when sliding against each other is known as sliding friction. So if I need to understand that, then how which is more, so we can say that static friction, the value of static friction is very large as compared to sliding friction, and the value of rolling friction is least as compared to sliding friction and static friction. Okay, now the question that comes up is, sir, why the value of static friction is more and why the value of rolling friction is less? This is all depends on the surface area of contact. So when we are studying about the surface area of contact, it is very pretty clear that in static friction the surface area of contact is comparatively very much as compared to sliding friction and rolling friction. So in rolling friction, since the surface area of contact is very less, so it is the least among these two frictions, and static friction, since surface area of contact is more, so it is most among these two frictions. Got it? Okay, now these were all about frictions that takes place in solids. Now you may say that, sir, you told us that if any object moves it applies friction, then is it not happens in case of the liquids? Yes, suppose this is a pipe, okay, and through this pipe what is happening? Through this pipe the liquid is flowing. Okay, the liquid is entering, and through this side the liquid is coming out. Now it is always there that if anything is in motion, its motion will always be getting opposed. Okay, so the only thing that comes here is the change is in the term. What friction we call in solids, that same will calling in case of these liquids and gases as drag force. So prior understanding that, we have to understand what are fluids. What are fluids? So what are fluids? Anything which flows is known as fluids. Anything which flows is known as fluids. Okay, so what are they? Example is liquids and gases. So anything which flows is known as fluids. Yeah, example, liquids and gases. Okay, fluids also apply a frictional force called drag force when an object is moving through them. So fluids also apply a frictional force called drag force when an object is moving through them. Okay, the next thing that comes is friction offered by fluids is also called drag. So the friction which is being offered by the fluid is known as drag. The next thing that comes up is the frictional force offered on moving objects through fluids, that is liquids or gases, is known as fluid friction. Is known as fluid friction. So what is that meaning? What we have studied, that anything which flows is known as fluid. Okay, example is liquid and gases. So fluid also apply a frictional force called drag force. So when anything is moving, suppose this fluid is moving, so to this particle of the fluid, the motion is this side, so there will be a force acting in the opposite direction. So that force which is acting in the opposite direction, that force is known as the drag force. Okay, so the friction offered by fluid is called as drag. In solids we call it as friction, and in liquid we call it as drag. And the frictional force offered on moving objects through fluids, liquids or gases is known as fluid friction. Got it? Okay, now this fluid friction depends on several factors. So what are those factors on which fluid friction depends? Let's see. Three factors on which fluid friction depends. So three factors on which fluid friction depends are, namely, number one, speed. So what happened? Fluid friction increase increases with the increase in the speed of an object with respect to the fluid. Means what? Fluid friction increases. So what happened? The fluid which is being flowing in a tube, so what happened, as the speed of the fluid will increase, speed of the object which is flowing in the liquid will increase, so the frictional force which is being applied will also increase. That's why what happens, the meteors or asteroids which is getting in contact with the atmospheric surface of the earth, they catch fire because they comes down with the huge speed, and as soon as they are getting in touch with the atmospheric surface, because of that huge drag force, they are catching the fire, and so they fall on the earth's surface as the broken star. Okay. Okay, next is nature of fluids. So how nature of fluid depends. So objects experience more drag in denser fluids. Means what? Objects experience more drag in denser fluid. What is the meaning of this? Suppose this is a you have three vessels, okay, three containers, and all the three are filled with different substances. Suppose this is container A, filled with one liquid. Suppose this is filled with water. This is another container. Suppose it is filled with, suppose, honey. And there is another vessel, third container, suppose C, and it is filled with oil. Okay. Now I am taking an object, okay, and I am just putting it under this. I'm just throwing it inside the container. Under this, okay, so the density of water, suppose the density of water in this case is W, density of this is honey, okay, and suppose density of this is oil. Now what will happen, now I have to see, we will be observing that the ball that I have thrown inside the fluid, in water it takes less amount of time to go to the to sink and reach the bottom of the surface of the vessel container, but in case of oil, the comparatively the time will be more, but in case of honey, the density, the comparatively it will be more. Okay, now why this is happening? Because right now we have studied that friction depends on one factor, which is nature of the fluid. So if the objects experience more drag in denser fluid, since the density of honey is comparatively very much as compared to oil, and it is comparatively more as compared to water, so what happened, that the object which is experiencing drag in denser fluid is more, and the ball which we are putting in the vessel of honey, it is taking more amount of time to sink as compared to in oil and water. Okay. Now the third thing that comes is shapes. In order to increase, we can increase friction also, we can decrease friction also, that is I will be discussing just after this. Okay, so in order to decrease friction, And if I want to decrease the friction, then what I have to do, I have to decrease the strength of the fluid. So in order to decrease the strength of fluid, drag, objects are designed to have a streamlined shape. To have a streamlined shape. Okay, that's why, means what, in order to decrease the strength of the fluid, if in order to decrease the fluid drag, the fluid, the always the objects are being streamlined, be it the wings of the bird or be it the shape of the um, aeroplanes, they are always being streamlined in order to decrease the drag force, decrease the drag force, that is the frictional force being applied by the air on the surface of the object. Okay. Okay, so now the next topic that we will be moving, so the three factors on which the fluid friction depends are namely speed of the fluid, speed, nature of fluid, and on shapes. Okay, now the next concept that we have to understand is the different ways by which we can increase and decrease friction, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of friction. So advantages, so what are the advantages of friction? It helps us in writing, walking, etc. Like as what I'm scribbling in the board, because of which you could see and take down the notes in your copy, that is because of friction. So because of friction, we can write, we can walk, okay, we can run. If friction was not there, all these things we could not do. Okay. Now the next thing that comes is the disadvantages of friction. Disadvantages of friction. So what are the disadvantages of friction? So the disadvantage of friction is that it causes wear and tear of the machine parts of an object, of the parts of an object, as it produces heat. Means what? See, what is the meaning of this? Suppose, suppose this is the gear. Now what will happen when this gear will just move, and it will come with the another of the gear. So these two tooths of the gear, the tooth of another gear will rub against each other, and because of this rubbing of the two tooths of the gear, it will be producing heat, and as it will produce heat, it will cause wear and tear of the parts of an object. Same thing happens, the soles of our shoes wears off. Okay, why it wears off? Because when we are continuously wearing the shoes and walks, the soles of the shoes keeps on rubbing against the road, and because of that rubbing, it generates heat, and because of that heat, what happens, it destroys the sole, so sole of our shoes wears off. Got it? Okay, now the next thing that will come in, next thing that we'll be studying is how can we increase friction. Methods to increase friction. So the methods to increase friction is that rubbing the hands, rubbing hands with stands by wrestlers before starting the match. So what happens? The two hands, they take a sand and they rub in their both the hands before they start the match, when they are about to wrestle. Why? Because that will increase the friction and they won't be slipping down. Okay. Next is what? Grooving in tires. Grooving in tires. So the tires, why the tires are being grooved? The tires are being grooved in order to increase the friction. Okay, if the friction is increased, then there won't, the wheels of the tire, the of the bikes won't be sliding, and the person who is driving won't be falling and causing any accidents. Okay. In soles, so in our soles also kind of grooving is being done in order to increase the friction so that the person who is wearing and walking doesn't slips away. Okay. Now the next thing that comes is methods to decrease friction. Methods to decrease friction. This you can write down as grooving in soles of shoes, threading in tires. Threading in tires means what? These are the tires, and in that new tire we may see like this small hair like structure is present. Okay, so these are the known as the threadings in tire, and why they are done? In order to decrease the friction, in order to increase the friction, so that the person who is driving the bike doesn't slips, falls, and doesn't slides and falls down and causes accidents. Okay. Now the methods to decrease friction. So the methods to decrease friction are: number one, by lubrication. By lubrication means what? Oiling, greasing, etc. So if we are applying lubrication, if we are oiling and greasing, so it will decrease the friction. And what will happen? The machine parts, since they are continuously rubbing against each other, that will be reduced. And as the rubbing will reduce, so the production of heat will also get reduced, and it will cause less wear and tear of the parts of an object. Okay. Now the next thing we can do is by applying powder in carom boards. So when we are applying powder in carom boards, then what will happen? It will decrease the friction, and easily the striker can slide on the carom boards, and we can play the match smoothly. Okay. One more thing, in if you tell that it is only present in the outside, is friction doesn't occur inside our body, and is there not any methods? Yeah, there are also methods inside our body. How? We can, just for an example, your extra knowledge I'm telling you. Suppose this is one bone, and suppose this is another bone. This is another bone. Okay. Now what will happen? These two bones continuously, when we are moving our hand or our legs, these two bones will rub against each other. And if they rub, what happens? The persons who are being, you may have heard that the persons who are suffering, who are in their early 60s or in mid 60s or in their end of 50s, they start suffering with the pains in their joints, in knees, in their shoulders. And what the doctor prescribes and diagnoses, that the fluid which is being present inside their joints starts getting drying off, so they are suffering with the pain. Now why? What happens when the fluid inside them is getting drying off? So the objects are rubbing, both the bones are in contact with each other and they are rubbing against each other. Since of that rubbing, heat is being generated and that is causing pain in their body. So in order to decrease that, a fluid is present in our body which is known as synovial fluid. And what is the function of this fluid? The function of this fluid is that it helps in reduction of the friction. Since it helps in reduction of the friction, so the heat is getting less generated. And so what is happening? There is no pain in our joints when we are moving. Got it? Okay. So till now we have studied that the three factors on which friction depends. The three factors were speed, nature of fluid, and we have studied about the shapes. So in case of speed, what we have understood, that if the speed in the fluid is more, the friction will be more. If the nature of fluid, what we have understood, it is mainly concerned with the density of the fluid. So if the density is more, drag force applied will be more. If the density is less, the drag force applied will be less. And we have understood about shapes. So in order to decrease the strength of the fluid, fluid drag, what we do, we shape the objects in shape of streamline. Okay. Now comes advantage. What are the advantages of friction? So the advantages of friction is that it helps us in writing, it helps us in walking, it helps us in running, on all those. And what are the disadvantages of friction? The disadvantage of friction is that it causes wear and tear of the parts of an object as it produces heat. Now you may tell that, sir, if there are advantages, then where you are telling about disadvantage? See, there are always two faces of a same coin. So if something is having disadvantage, it doesn't mean that it won't be having disadvantage, right? Next comes method to increase friction. The methods to increase friction is rubbing hands with sands by wrestlers before starting the match. It will increase their friction so that it won't be sliding down. Grooving in soles of shoes, threading in tires, all these are methods of increasing the friction. Okay, that's why what will happen, you may see that if your hands are getting wet and if you're climbing the mountain, you may slide it down. Okay, because it is making the hands very much smooth, so decreasing the area of contact. And methods to decrease friction is by lubrication, that is by oiling, greasing, painting. Okay, and by applying powder in carom boards. So these are the different methods how can we increase the friction. Got it? Okay, now the next point of discussion that comes up here is about pressure. So before understanding what is pressure, you have heard this term, I am having a lot of pressure, my mind is full of pressure. So what is this pressure? So prior understanding this pressure, first we have to come across a very basic definition, that is thrust. That is thrust. So what is thrust? Suppose this is the wicket. Okay, and suppose I am putting the pointed end to underneath the ground. Okay, now in this what is happening, I am applying a force perpendicular to this surface. I am applying the force perpendicular to this surface. Okay, so these perpendicular force with perpendicular force which is being applied to this surface, this is known as thrust. Okay, so if I want to define thrust, then how can I define? I can simply define as force acting, force acting the perpendicular direction is known as thrust. So force which is acting in the perpendicular direction is known as thrust. Got it? Okay. And if I want to define pressure, then how can I define? Thrust acting per unit area of the surface is called pressure. Is called pressure. Okay, so what is thrust? Thrust is the force acting perpendicular direction is known as thrust. And what is pressure? The thrust which is acting unit per unit area of the surface is known as pressure. Understood? Okay, so suppose if I need to frame it mathematically, then how can I frame it? So mathematically, how can I frame it? As already we have studied that pressure is what? Thrust acting per unit area. So thrust is what? Perpendicular force. So I can say pressure is equal to force by area. What is this? This is mathematical expression. Now the question that comes up is, then what will be the units? So that's a very easy question. What will be the unit? As already we have studied, SI unit of force is Newton and SI unit of area is meter. So I can write it as Newton per meter square, or it can also be written as Newton per meter square. And it is also known as, this Newton per meter square is known as Pascal. Pascal. Okay. So why we call it as Pascal? Because it was discovered by Louis Blaise Pascal. It was discovered by Blaise Pascal. And because of his term only, what happened? The unit has been given as Pascal. Okay. Now you may ask me, sir, is there any relationship between a Newton per meter square and Pascal? Yes, obviously there is a relationship between Newton per meter square and Pascal. That is 1 Newton per meter square is equal to 1 Pascal. Okay, so remember, this is the mathematical expression between Newton per meter square and Pascal. Now the question that we have to remember, that what are the factors on which pressure depends? Okay, so pressure depends on number one. As you can see, P is equal to F by A. So number one is thrust. So how can we say that with thrust? So pressure is directly proportional with the force or the thrust acting on the surface. Okay, directly proportional. Now what is the meaning of this term directly proportional? Directly proportional means if I'm increasing the value of pressure, the value of force will increase, or vice versa. If I'm increasing the pressure value of force, the value of pressure will increase. Okay, and the another factor on which it depends is area of contact. Area of contact. So how it depends on area of contact? Pressure is inversely proportional to the area of contact. Okay, now what is the meaning of the term inversely proportional? Inversely proportional. Now, inversely proportional means what? If the value of pressure is increasing, the value of area will decrease, and if the value of area is increasing, the value of pressure will decrease. Understood? Okay. Now, the next thing that comes up is, what are the applications of this pressure? So, some applications. So, number one is, we use the sharp end of knife to cut an object instead of blunt end. Instead of blunt ends. Now, what is the meaning of this meaning? A sharp end of the knife. Suppose if you have seen the sharp part of the knife, we take it like this. So in this sharp part, what happens? This surface area of contact is comparatively less. So if we have studied, if the surface area of contact is comparatively less, then what will happen? The pressure that is being applied will be more. Since the pressure being applied is more, so it becomes easy for us to cut those objects. Okay. Then second is what? The broader straps of the bag. The broader straps of bag is what? Since the area is more, so pressure will be less. Since the pressure applied is less, so there is less pressure being applied on our shoulders. So it becomes easy for us to carry the bag. The load present inside the bag becomes easy for us to carry. That's why the straps of the bag are being made broader. So these are the different applications where what happens? That pressure is being applied. Okay. Now it's not that only pressure is applied in case of solids. Pressure is also applied in case of liquids. So how can we say? So a liquid exerts pressure. A liquid exerts pressure in all directions. It's not that it's confined that to that surface area of contact only pressure will be applied. No, liquids applied pressure in all direction. This you will be studying in your class in the next higher class, that is in your ninth, about the Pascal's law. Till then you have to understand, suppose if this is a container filled with water I am taking, and I am just pinching these parts, so what can I see? The amount with which the water is oozing out will be same. So the pressure is being applied in all directions will be same. And what happens with depth? With depth, pressure in liquids, with depth, liquid pressure, with depth, liquid pressure increases. Liquid pressure increases. So how can we explain this? Suppose you have taken a container filled with water. Okay. And now what I have done, I have made 3 points, 3 pinches, A, B, and C. Okay, suppose this is A, this is B, and this is C. Now we will be observing that from this point the amount of water that will be coming out, the distance from the container will be less. But from B, the amount of water that will be coming out, the distance will be comparatively more as compared to C. And in C, the pressure at which the water will come out, the distance will be comparatively very much as compared to the container. That's why we say that with depth, liquid pressure increases. And because of this reason only, there may be a question why the base of a dam is made broader. Always if you have seen a dams, what happens? The basis of them is made broader. Now what will be the answer to this question? Suppose if this is my dam, if this is my dam, you can see this area is made broader. Why? Because with the depth the liquid in pressure increases, so the pressure being applied to this portion of the dam will be comparatively more as compared to this one. So if I am making the it as broad, so it can withstand that pressure. Okay, so that's why since liquid pressure increases with depth, so what happened? The basis of the dam is made broader. Got it? Okay. Now the next thing is that if we are discussing pressure in fluids, then not only the liquid will apply pressure, but it's very pretty clear that air will also apply pressure. And so that pressure is known as atmospheric pressure. Atmospheric pressure. Okay, so what is atmospheric pressure? It is defined as the weight of the air column in the unit area above that point. Above the, it is defined as weight of the air column. Suppose above my head, the weight of the air column which is applying on this is known as atmospheric pressure. Okay, so one more thing we have to remember, that with increase in altitudes, with increase in altitude, atmospheric pressure decreases. So with increase in altitude, atmospheric pressure decreases. That's why what happens, you may see that when we are climbing up any mountains or something, the nose of some person starts to bleed. Why? Because there is pressure inside our blood, with which the flowing known as blood pressure. Okay, and also the air is applying pressure. So when the air is getting, when the pressure is getting decreased, so what is happening, the air pressure is getting decreased, the blood pressure inside our body is getting increased, so it needs some medium to come up, so the blood starts coming out of our nose. Also the same thing happens, what happens if we are taking any balloon and putting it above the atmospheric surface, right? Above the atmospheric surface. So suppose if this is the balloon, so slowly what happens, air is filled above this, so slowly what happens, the size of the balloon keeps on increasing, and finally what happened, these balloon burst off. Why? Because the pressure inside this is getting increased, and the pressure outside the atmosphere is starting getting decreased as it is going above the altitudes. So it needs some medium to come up, and finally the balloon get burst off and the pressure gets come out. Okay, so I hope that it is very pretty clear about the atmospheric pressure. So this is what you have to study in pressure. So I hope you have enjoyed the class a bit more, enjoyed the class, the about, you have understood about the mathematical expression, you have understood the definitions about the units, who discovered them, on what factors pressure depends, and some applications related to that. And also you have understood about liquid pressure, and you have understood about air pressure. So this was what all we have to study in this chapter. I hope these will make your concepts very clear. If you like the class, you can click on the like button, and you can also post your comments, so that your queries can be taken up. And if you like the class, you can also click on the bell icon, so that as soon as the new topic of this of physics is being uploaded, the first notification will be ringing on your devices. Okay, so again we'll meeting on the next class. Till then, bye.
Goodbye.